Hey there, what are you doing?
Just looking at birds.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris. Join me as I interview avid birders to learn more about birds, birding, and those who love both. This is the podcast's second and final stop in Texas, at Dogwood Canyon. Thankfully, there's no plane noise this episode, just some of the cars on the nearby road. This is also the 10th episode. Whether you've been here since the first episode with Holly or are listening for the first time, I really appreciate it. Today my guest is Katie Christman. She grew up in upstate New York and began working with birds at the Vermont Institute of Natural Science. There, she helped to rehabilitate birds of prey. Katie now works as an education specialist for the Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center, where she manages educational programming, conducts bird walks, and leads science initiatives, including the annual Christmas bird count. It's good to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
As an educator and someone passionate about sharing nature with others, what spurred you onto this path?
It's a really awesome question. I think one of the things that really encouraged me to get involved in this field and just in nature was growing up outside. I grew up on 68 acres of land in upstate New York, and my parents, especially my dad, were always encouraging us to be outside. You know, our parents were like, hey, you're driving us nuts, go outside and play, right? And, so I always had this fondness for nature growing up. And my dad would take us to these falconry shows. And so I always loved seeing, the hawks flying over and everything, just really loved it. And so I think that love of nature was just kind of innate. It was just kind of there. And it wasn't until I started getting older, going to school, that I had people that came into my life that said, hey, you have an interest in this. Let's nurture that interest.
Yeah. I know before we started recording, you mentioned someone who took a particular interest in you, a science teacher.
Yeah. So when I was in junior high school, my science teacher, Mr. Russo, I loved him. He reminded me of Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Okay.
You remember that, right? And he also had that passion and love, made science really fun. And he came up to me one day and he said, Katie, there is this science camp in New York. It was through the Department of Environmental Conservation. They have these conservation camps. I'd love for you to apply and to go. Yeah. And funds were a little tight, at that time for us, and I didn't think I could afford it, but he found a sponsor through a garden club that sponsored me to be able to go. And so I went and I fell in love with it. I mean, we were outside, we were camping, we were kayaking, fishing, doing all that stuff, and just learning about ecology. I mean, how nerdy can you get? Like, you're a teenager going to science camp, right?
How funny.
And, so I just appreciated the fact that he was willing to, just initiate this sponsorship for me to go. And so I went a couple years after that, continued to go, and actually was on a staff. And so that just kind of was the catalyst to get me more involved into science and understanding that, hey, I can step into this field as my career.
How neat. So that was kind of a way, your entrance into this broader field of sharing science, nature, having an interest in it, and then also sharing it with others. But when did you first take an interest in birding?
Yeah, so birding, again, like I said, some of it was innate, but then I just kind of loved birds. I grew up, again, at a time where Captain Planet, Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter was really big. And so I had like a really cheap $15 pair of binoculars from Walmart, a very simple bird guide. And when I went into college, I brought those with me. We went on a field study trip to Florida with my biology professor. And I was trying to bird with these binoculars, could not see a thing. They just don't work. And he's like, Katie, we have to do something about this. And so we were it was the Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge. I remember this place. It was amazing. And we were in the gift shop, and he pointed out, he's like, here's a Sibley's bird book. You need to buy this. So I bought it. I actually still have that to this day. And, because I had all the other guides. I had like Nat Geo. I had the Audubon guides. Things were a little bit different. You didn't have iPhones where you could look everything up. So you had to go to the library. You had to do all that. So I was forever just looking at things, just so curious about everything going on. But he was the one that kind of turned me into birding. You're in Florida. Here's this hub of all of these amazing birds that are there. Yeah. And how can you not just turn away and you're seeing crocodiles and alligators and all these amazing things. So I credit my biology professor for just kind of spurring me in. And then I finally got a better pair of binoculars.
Yes, that's good.
Spent a little bit more money on those.
Thinking back further, what was your earliest memory of a bird?
My earliest memory of a bird, oh my gosh. So I always remember, we had a lot of animals growing up. We lived in the country, farming country. Cats were all over the place, right? And so I do not recommend doing this. Your cats need to be inside, y'all. Okay? But we had outdoor cats. And my cats would always bring animals inside, particularly birds.
Sure.
So I was just fascinated by the birds being brought in. And some of them, unfortunately, were dead. But me being a young nature nerd person was just really curious about here's this bird, or you're in the country, you're finding a lot of baby birds. And I just had this compassion for the animals I was finding, but also very curious about there's a nest. When are they going to hatch? When are they going to fly? And just that curiosity of seeing all that happen. You got to explore so much more. I mean, we had a creek running in our front yard. Yeah. And we'd be playing with the crayfish and fish and frogs. I mean, all that and it just kind of just explodes from there.
Fair enough. So it didn't necessarily start with a given specific bird, but it was more just that, not really process, but the act of those cats bringing that to you each day. Yes. Going to work each day at a place like Dogwood Canyon, you probably encounter all sorts of birds. What is a particularly memorable encounter you've had with a bird?
Gosh, there are a lot of different ones. We are in a really unique area here in Texas. We're in what's called the Central Flyway. Okay. So we see over 600 species of birds that fly through here. And moving from New York, it's a little bit different in terms of migration and what you're seeing and everything. So it was a big learning curve for me when I first moved here. But I think one of the biggest things, people would always tell me, wait until you see the painted buntings. And I didn't know what they were talking about until summer came. And all of a sudden, here I am being exposed to some of the most beautiful birds I had not seen, except being exposed to that in a zoo. And so you see the male and female painted buntings. The female is this beautiful iridescent green. And then you see the male, and he's got blue and red and green on him. And it's just so overwhelming to see that. And then as we're getting out more and I'm starting to learn more about Texas, I had the opportunity to go down to a place called High Island, which is down towards the coast during prime migration season. And all of a sudden, you take 5 steps to your right and there's 20 warblers in one tree. I'm just this is amazing. I have never experienced this before, and I felt incredibly blessed in that moment. So I think just stepping into this new world where there's so many birds in one area and truly grasping the concept that Texas is a really, really amazing state because it can hold that diversity because of the habitat it has. Yeah. When I moved here, a lot of people always told me Texas is flat. And I was like, well, certain areas are, but there's so much more to Texas than just what you might see on TV. There's just this diversity of ecosystems that are here that needs to be conserved and protected. And I think I finally grasped that when I started to see all the birds that were here. Started off with the painted bunting.
Painted bunting is definitely a wonderful bird to see. Is there a bird you would like to see next?
I have a big list, but I can't tell everybody all that list because there's so many of them. I'm a big raptor fan, so that's what I did before I moved here. Yeah. And so I would really love to see in the wild, not in captivity, the Aplomado falcon. I'd also really love to see the harpy eagle. Seen them in captivity, and they're just so strikingly beautiful. So those are a couple on my list. I don't want to go through all of them because we'll be here for a very long time.
Are either of those found in Texas?
So the Aplomata falcon is.
Okay.
Harpy eagle is definitely not. You have to go into like South America to see that specific species.
Okay.
They're incredible birds.
Yeah. I will have to look them up.
Yeah.
When you go birding, aside from binoculars, bird guides, apps, what is something you never leave home without?
Yeah, so I'm a little old school, and I always have a pencil and a notebook with me. I have apps on my iPhone, but I don't like to use them in the field because I find I'm like scrolling through my phone, and I'm losing a lot of time looking at birds and everything, and it drains my phone battery.
Yes.
So you'll always find me with some type of notebook because I also like to make notes of everything else I'm seeing. So I like to write a little bit more in the field.
Okay. Do you usually like to keep track of all the birds you see when you go on a birding trip?
I do. And especially since there are some times, where you just get stumped. And so I like to make notes. And then there's other things I see that are not birds, like plants and other animals that I run across. And I like to note that. I like to journal when I'm outside.
Yeah.
It's not always about seeing the birds for me. It's the experience that I'm having in nature. So I like to write down those moments when I'm outside.
Nice. So it's not necessarily data collection. It's more just that experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
As an education specialist, you interact with new birders frequently. What is a piece of advice you would share with our listeners who may be newer to birding?
Ooh, I like this question because I remember when I first started birding and feeling so intimidated when I first started. And one of the things that I can tell you is don't worry about what other people are doing or seeing or what their list looks like. Take it one bird at a time. I tell people when I teach classes, stop trying to focus on, hey, I have to learn 50 bird species, right? Because you're going to overwhelm yourself. Start off with 5. Start off with the 5 that you know. Learn their habitat, their calls, what they look like in, the breeding season, non-breeding season. Start off with that, okay? And then work your way towards learning more from there. It's always really good to get a mentor or someone who can walk alongside you, help you grow, help encourage you in there, and again, find a group. Maybe there's a Audubon club or an organization, because it's nice to enjoy nature outside by yourself, but it's also really great to be out with other people and enjoy that. And you can make so many more connections with people when you're doing that, and they can help you understand and learn what you're seeing. You don't have to do it by yourself, is basically what I'm saying.
Audubon societies in pretty much every city offer bird field trips, so it's a great way to get started.
Exactly. I mean, we're even international.
Oh, wow.
So you could go down into places like Belize, and you could find Audubon down in there. And that's the great thing about our reach and who we're trying to impact.
Yeah. Transitioning from birding to plants, considering the value of planting native plants at your home, do you have any native plants where you live?
So right now I don't. I just moved into a smaller place in an apartment. So it's a little bit more difficult. But here in the downtown area, I am part of a community garden. So I have a plot. So I'm able to do a little bit. And we do have native plants that are in some of the plots there. So that's the extent of what I'm able to do right now until I kind of get my own bigger place.
Okay. Of the plants you have on your little plot, what is your favorite or most recent addition?
Yeah, so we just put in, I'm trying to remember some of them. They have one full plot that is just sunflowers.
Okay.
And then we do a lot of vegetables as well. So I was just able to do tomatoes and green beans, things that can feed our community.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. But I know they'll be putting in, I think they put in like lantana and a couple others I cannot remember off the top of my head.
All right.
Yeah.
Are any of these particularly interesting to birds?
Oh, yeah, definitely for sure. So anything that is going to provide food or shelter is going to be an attraction to birds. The sunflowers in particular, we actually leave up into the fall and the winter season. So not only do we benefit from that, but the birds coming in benefit from that as well. Yeah.
And those are something that sunflowers, is that something that I could place in a pot, or would I need to put it in the ground?
It really depends on the species of sunflower.
Okay.
So you you can start off in a pot, but they're going to get to be really, really big.
Okay.
So you definitely want to have a lot of space to be able to plant those and everything. The thing with a lot of our native species here in Texas, and this is why we try to encourage people to plant native, is the root system. And that's why you need a lot more depth than you do width in terms of planting. So you're looking at root systems that are going to grow 2, 4, 6, 8 feet into the ground.
Okay.
They're adapted to a habitat that often, gets really hot and gets really dry.
Yes.
So they have to be able to withstand areas where they have to go a little bit deeper to find water because they're going for long periods without water and everything. So that's what our native plants are really well adapted to.
Yes.
So we try to encourage people, hey, like this native plant's great. You don't have to water it as much compared to watering your lawn every couple days and everything.
Yeah, my last few guests that I've spoke to about native plants, that seems to be one of the biggest benefits, is not having to water it as much and having a plant that is more likely to survive and thrive in this environment as opposed to a plant you've taken from somewhere else.
Exactly. And one of the things it's so hard, because sometimes you live in areas and they have this structure of how your lawn's supposed to look, how your yard's supposed to look. And so we're not trying to, I guess, fight against that. We're trying to work with people in terms of how can we work together as a community for what's good for you and the environment.
Yes.
And that's us trying to come in and bridge those connections with people. So as you come in and say, hey, let's get away from the lawn, how can we communicate that in a way that works best for everyone, I guess is what we're trying to say.
Yeah.
And so native plants can help do that, It's something we're trying to communicate really well, educate really well with people within our community on that.
So depending where you live and depending on maybe HOA approval, you could start that with a sunflower.
Yeah, you could. It's something super easy. I think a lot of people, they know what it is. They like it. It looks pretty. It's easy to plant, Yeah.
All right, now let's move on to our bird segment, where my guests have a chance to share a bit about a bird of their choice. For this episode, Katie has chosen the American Kestrel. I remember the first time I saw an American Kestrel, it was surveying a football field from one of the goalposts. I was immediately impressed that it had the features of a larger bird of prey in such a compact package. Aside from football fields, where else might you find these birds?
Yeah, so the American Kestrel is a species of falcon that you can find all throughout the U.S. In particular, they really love areas that are open, fields, prairies, any place where they can find some of their favorite food. And in particular, they love insects. About half of their diet's insects, and then they love to eat rodents. And so if you think about that, where are you going to find a lot of insects? In a field or a prairie, something along those lines.
So they usually eat a lot of insects and rodents. Will they eat anything else?
They will. They'll eat birds, which I find funny. I was teaching a class the other day, and the kids were like, wait, so your kestrel's a cannibal? And I was like, well, kind of in a way, They do eat other birds. They might eat lizards. They might eat snakes. Their diet can vary. It's really going to depend on where they're located, the habitat, what's available at that time. I know this time of year, we have a ton of, katydids and crickets and things like that. So those are plenty.
So then their diet can change with the season and with their environment where they live. When you talk about what's available, are kestrels the type where they might stay in one area for a long period of time, or will they move from place to place?
So pretty much kestrels are non-migratory. However, I always tell people, birds do not read bird guides or field guides, right?
Yes.
So you can certainly say they won't move, but that might change based off of habitat. It might change based off of food availability. It can also change based off of climate that we're seeing, changes in our climate. Right now, there is a big, drought happening in the West, and we are seeing shifts in wildlife. So I can't imagine in the next couple months how that might shift the movement of certain wildlife species, bird species, in the next year or so. We kind of saw that happen in the winter here. Texas got hit by a really big storm, and it impacted our bird movements. I mean, I can't tell you how many calls we got about people seeing all the robins, all the siskins, so many birds that were here. And part of that was from other things that happened before the storm happened.
Yeah.
So much can change for birds in just a couple months.
And from what I've heard, the kestrel is pretty good at adapting to some of these changes.
They are. They do require, certain types of habitat, like they are cavity nesters, but they can, as long as they have their food available, they can find that habitat. Habitat is one of the things that has affected their numbers here in the U.S. So the lack of, the space to find the food, and the cavities that they need to raise their young has affected their population numbers. So we have seen a decline in population numbers over the past 50 years, but they are able to adapt. Not as easily as, say, like a pigeon or a grackle, who are like, hey, I'll go hang out in the Walmart parking lot.
Yes.
But I think, they are able to see an area and be okay with that.
When we talk about what they eat this wide variety of prey, and they like to hang out near these open areas to hunt. How do they go about hunting? Like, if they want to go after an insect, are they hovering low to the ground looking for these insects? Are they staying at these high points and using their excellent vision to identify insects? How do they go about that hunt?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these guys, a lot of times you'll see them, they like to hang out on a certain area. So they like to hang out maybe alongside the road or on a post, and they're going to be searching for their food. Once they see that, you want to watch out, especially if you're that cricket or that rodent. And one of the other really cool things that they do, which I absolutely love, is a technique called hover hunting.
Okay.
And you can see this with some other birds, like osprey, for instance, do this. And they will think of a helicopter, for instance. They stay stationary above where they want to land or what they want to grab. And the kestrel does that. So the kestrel has this laser focus. It's going to stay focused on its prey. The head doesn't move, but the body's moving, and they're flapping their wings in midair. It's a really cool thing to see. We actually have a video of it on our Facebook page if you guys want to see it.
Sure.
And then they're able to drop down and grab their prey, and they fly off with their prey, and they'll go eat it. So it's a really cool technique that they use. And again, it has to do with habitat. There's not a lot of perching areas in a field.
Yeah.
So what are they going to do? How are they going to fly?
They hover. When I've seen kestrel, usually I only see them alone. Are they in groups, smaller groups, and pairs?
Yeah, so kestrels are pretty solitary. And a lot of birds, sorry. A lot of people seem to think that birds are always together. There are certain species that flock together.
Sure.
When you get into the raptors, that's not always true. There are some exceptions to the rule. So they can be very territorial, especially when it's not during the breeding season. So they will tend to be by themselves. They'll hunt by themselves. Now, when you see two kestrels hanging out, it's probably because they're a male and a female. It's breeding season. They're raising their young. Once they finish that, they're off on their own. Speaking
of breeding season, you talked about them being cavity nesters. How big are the clutches for these birds?
Yeah, so usually they're going to have anywhere from 3 to 6 young in one clutch, and they usually do one clutch per year. It's a lot of energy to raise young, and it takes a lot of time.
Yeah. How long does that process take when the eggs have been laid? Does the female stay with the eggs for a certain period of time? Does the male help at all?
Yeah, so it's going to take a couple months. So it's usually about 28 to 31 days to incubate the eggs. And then you're looking at another 4 to 6 weeks to raise the young to the point where they can fledge so they can fly and hunt on their own.
Yes.
And both the male and female will actually trade spots.
Okay.
Something that's really cool is they have a brood patch on their stomach. And so it's actually a bare patch, and it's a way for them to keep the eggs nice and warm. They'll take turns. One thing that's really cool, if you guys ever notice, male and females can be different shapes sizes.
Yes.
And so the male raptors are usually smaller than the females.
Okay.
Scientists speculate that some of that is so they can get different types of food when they're hunting.
Okay.
And also think the female's going to be carrying the eggs.
Yes.
So something that's really neat. The kestrels are also, their plumage is different in coloration. So females spend a little bit more time on the nest. Males also are more brightly colored.
Okay.
So they're going to be spending time to track the females. So they're a really unique species. You don't see all the raptors that have the difference in the plumage coloration.
Yes.
Snowy owls do, and there's a couple others that do, but
Okay.
they're really unique in that sense.
When you mentioned the brood patch, do both the male and the female have a brood patch?
It depends. So when I did rehab work, we would sometimes find males that had a brood patch, but not always.
Okay.
So I think it just varies. I don't know the exact specifications on that.
Yeah, why it occurs. Yeah.
Yeah.
When we talk about them nesting and we talk about having fledglings, we have a clutch of 2 to 6. When is a kestrel ready to leave the nest? One of the things that I watched in the past few months was a Cornell nest box camera of a group of kestrel fledglings. And I noticed I got to watch the parent come in through the little hole, drop prey. The kestrels would each take some of it. And there were more aggressive kestrels. In that bunch, there was this one kestrel that would always eat the food first. And some of the others would wait at the side and get what was left. So I noticed it was so neat to see that process, right, of how they would grow and how they seemed to have personalities. But I noticed they would flap their wings in this very small confined space. And I know they're preparing for flight.
Yeah.
In the wild, there aren't these nest boxes. They have these cavities. Are they inside these little cavities flapping their wings just like this, or are they getting out on branches?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both. In a sense, I mean, they're going to be practicing. They're going to be building up their muscles in order to help them do that. And so sometimes what people see is, the birds branching out. They're stepping out onto branches, and they're taking that first little step.
Yes.
And so that's where a lot of people kind of get a little scared because oh my gosh, like there's this bird on the ground, and it can't fly. What do I do? And it's actually a fledgling. They're at that point where they're taking their first steps. It's like a baby taking the first steps and they're kind of wobbly. Yeah. It's the same thing with a fledgling. And, we always tell people, if you find a bird, it's not injured, it's fully feathered, eyes are open, put it back in the nest. Yeah. It'll probably jump back out again, but the parents are nearby, they'll feed it. So they're at that stage when they're flapping their wings like that. You see them kind of venturing out a little bit. That's where they're getting ready to fledge soon. And one day you'll come by and they won't be there. And you're like, oh, the birds left the nest already.
Yeah. Is flight the primary criteria for leaving the nest, ability to fly?
Pretty much. The birds will try those first flights. And until they can sustain that flight, it'll be a little difficult for them to be on their own. Here's the thing, though, that I find really funny. You'll still see, and we see it here all the time during the breeding season, the baby birds follow the parents around, begging for food. Yes. So they have fledged the nest. They're flying on their own, but they still follow the parents. And there gets a point in time where they stop coming to the parents for food and everything. But that process takes maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and they're off on their own.
So some, even with the ability to fly, will come back.
Yes, they will.
Because free food is enticing.
Yes, exactly. I feel like people are the same way.
Yes, similar, yes. When we think of distinct parts of the kestrel, as far as their body parts, and we think of ways to distinguish them, they're a pretty fast bird, so you're not always going to get a good look at them.
Yeah.
What is maybe a part that we could identify them besides their plumage and their distinct bill? What else could we pay attention to identify them? Yeah,
so the kestrel, one of the things I look at with the falcon species, this is really unique to the falcon species, they have what's called a malar stripe. And that stripe goes underneath the eye. Think of it like football players, basketball, or baseball players. Yes. They put a stripe under their eye. It helps with glare. Yes. Glare of the sun. And falcons themselves have a really unique shape compared to some of the other raptors. You're looking at a bird that has a really long tail, and their wings are kind of sharply pointed at the end. Yes. Compared to, say, like a booteal, like a red-tailed hawk. They have a more wide fan tail, these wide wings because they're designed for soaring flight. Yes. Falcons are designed for speed. And so when you're looking at these birds, that's something that you can also look at when they're in flight. That's where I think a lot of people get tripped up, but that's something I look at. And also, they're spending a lot of time, out in fields along the highway, hanging out on posts and everything. Yes. When I work with beginner birders, they have a hard time differentiating them from mourning doves.
Okay.
And if you look at a mourning dove is a lot more robust. It has this tiny head and a big body,
Yes.
tiny tail, right? But the kestrels have this really unique behavior. It's called a tail tick.
Okay.
So what they end up doing is the tail will bob up and down.
Hmm.
I'm not quite sure what that is. What we see here, we actually have a kestrel here in captivity. He's
Okay.
an imprinted kestrel. And one of the things I've noticed with him is when he's really interested in something, like when he sees us and he knows we're bringing food,
Yes.
he'll do that tail tick.
Okay.
So when I know he's getting ready to move or to come to me, he'll do the tail tick and then he's flying to us.
Huh.
So those are a couple things that I think can help people. Falcons just have very unique adaptations compared to some of the other birds of prey.
You mentioned having one here on campus.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of the why and just a little bit more about that?
Sure. So our kestrel, we've had him for 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
and he is a non-releasable bird of prey. And it's not because we don't want him to go out into the wild, it's because he can't.
Okay.
Some people found him as a fledgling. You know, he was just getting ready to fledge the nest, and they decided to keep him, which is actually illegal if you don't have a permit, and they tried to
Okay.
raise him.
Oh.
They realized, one, that they couldn't do that, and two, it was really difficult to do. It requires a lot of specialized care to take care of them.
Yes.
In the process of doing that, he became what we called imprinted on people. So he recognizes himself within people instead of really within birds. And so he doesn't necessarily have a fear of people. So when he sees me, for instance,
Yes.
he comes right over because he knows he's going to get food from me. He's very comfortable around me. He's comfortable around other people.
Yes.
So because of that, he can't go back out into the wild. And so I understand that sometimes that's hard for people to grasp that. We would love for him to go back out, but unfortunately, he can't. So that's why we have him here in captivity, so he can educate others now about kestrels, birds, and just how important they are.
In your experiences with him, in a typical week, how often do you interact with him?
So we interact with him every single day.
Okay.
So he gets to see us. He gets to see all the staff every day. He gets trained every day. We do enrichment with him. So he knows, again, like if we come back, he's trained to jump into his crate, get weighed, different things like that. And a lot of people sometimes worry like, oh, he's by himself. Does he get lonely? And again, like kestrels in the wild, birds are mainly solitary.
Yeah.
They don't spend necessarily time in flocks. There are a couple exceptions, like think of a mallard duck, like they have a mate for life. He's pretty territorial. He likes his space.
Yes.
So his space is his space, and we kind of keep it that way for him. He has his own area where he can fly in his enclosure, and he has that space to enjoy.
When you talk about training, what kind of training is going on? And I guess what is the training that's happening this week?
We strongly believe in using positive reinforcement training with all of our animals, all of our birds. And what that means is we invite our animals to choose to work with us.
Okay.
We don't ever want to force them to do something they don't want to do. It's the same thing with people, right?
Yeah.
Let's say we're asking him a simple behavior. So that would be sitting on our gloved hand calmly.
Yes.
So if he's doing that, he gets rewarded with food,
Sure.
which is his favorite thing. I mean,
Yes.
you can't deny that, right? And so we're reinforcing the behavior with something he likes.
Yes.
If it's something, let's say he is just having an off day, which happens sometimes, he doesn't want to come out, then we don't force him to come out. So right now, some of our focuses are on scale training. So he's trained to come to the scale on his own.
Okay.
So we can get a weight on him. And then he's trained to come into a crate on his own.
Okay.
So then we can take him out of his enclosure and travel with him. So those are the behaviors that we work on with him.
Yeah.
Right now, we don't go into his enclosure when he's in there because that's his space.
Yes.
He's very territorial of that, so we give him his space. Our owl's a little bit different. Our owl does not mind us going in there, but we found when the kestrel hit the breeding season and became sexually mature,
Yes.
he wasn't sure whether to mate with us or to attack us to defend his space. So we had to find a solution that worked best and was safe for all of us. And so now he knows, hey, when my person comes, I'm going to come to a specific spot. I'm going to jump into my crate, and then we can enter his enclosure without him being in there.
When you talk about enrichment, what are some things you do for enrichment for the kestrel?
Yeah, so enrichment, and if folks don't know what enrichment is, if you go to the zoo, you might see them do, maybe a fish cake for a seal, or put it in a ball with the tigers, right? So because he's not in captivity, he's not getting exposure to all the natural things he would.
Yes.
So we want to reinforce natural behaviors in captivity. So something, for instance, he loves food.
Yes.
He's a very food-motivated bird. He loves insects.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for instance, we might hide mealworms in a little sand pit for him, and he has to scratch at the sand, to find that. We might, he caches some of his food. So I might hide food around his enclosure, and he has to find it. Yeah. So those are some things we might do with him. We just put a nest box in there because he was exhibiting some different breeding behaviors.
Yes.
And he's actually been going in there, going in and out, allowing him to exhibit those natural behaviors. So those are some things we do with him.
Yeah.
Probably right now you'll find him up in his tree. He loves his tree, likes to spend time way up in there, and he can see everything around him. Yeah.
When you talk about enrichment and some of these behaviors that are natural behaviors that he doesn't necessarily get to partake in very often, we talked earlier about what great hunters kestrels are.
Yeah.
And here he's being fed. How can he, or how do you cater to that, I guess, to still allow him to, I don't know, hunt? You mentioned the mealworm scratching at the sand. Are there any other things you do when you give him other things like other insects to allow him to hunt?
Yeah, so we don't feed live food like any live rats or birds or anything like that. You're looking at the ethics of that and making sure you're being humane both to him and the animals he's being fed. The most we might do is hiding crickets or mealworms or things like that, because those are easier for him to catch. And so that's the most we might do in terms of live feeding.
Yes.
And exposing him to that. So that's about the extent of it for him.
And I guess because of the people who took him in when he was young, did that kind of interfere with the, I don't know, growth of that skill of hunting because of how they, started that?
That's a really good question. And this is something we talk about a lot, actually. Yeah. I try to ask other people who have birds of prey a lot, because you're trying to, with imprinting, sometimes I question and ask, how much is nature? How much is the imprinting?
Yes.
How much of those instincts does he have?
Yeah.
So that, I think, is something we are always trying to figure out and trying to work with and trying to make sure he has the best life possible in captivity.
Yes.
And so sometimes we just don't fully know or understand.
Yes.
I know he doesn't have as much fear. Our owl, on the other hand, I mean, he would walk right up to you and sit on your shoulder. So I know that fear's not there, but I also know, like, our owl, we didn't see as much breeding behavior from him. I don't know. So I don't know all the answers with them, but I also know we're trying to provide the best care we can.
Yeah.
Because they cannot go back out into the wild. I don't know if that fully answers the question. It's still a mystery. Some of the things are a mystery to us. I don't fully understand everything just because of that imprinting with them.
You talked about the use of a scale. So that's one of the ways you're trying to collect data and better understand this bird. Yeah. What are some other things other data you're collecting to better understand this kestrel? For
both of our birds, we actually do health checks throughout the year.
Yes.
So they get looked over. We make sure their eyes are looking good, ears are looking good, feet look really good.
Yeah.
We do get weights on them daily. You see a lot of fluctuations within their weights, especially when you come out of breeding season and then into the winter. Really interesting to see how that changes throughout the year, and we just also look at a lot of behavior. That's also data as well. It's not always necessarily numbers, but you just look at how are they responding to training? How is this working? Okay, this isn't working. So how do we change this? And a lot of times when you're training, when you're working with animals, I think as people, we naturally will say, well, the bird didn't do this, so it's their fault. And you're like, no, it's my fault. I, the person, am responsible for what's going on here.
Yes.
And I have to learn how to respond to that. So as we see, as I'm training and working with the bird and I'm looking at how they respond, I'm like, okay, I have to change my response.
Yeah.
And I have to see what can we do to make this better. So if I'm looking at like, oh, like the animal's not eating, like it doesn't seem very interested. Well, what is weight at? As I feel the keel, like where's the fat on the keel feeling like? If I look at the feet and I'm like, oh man, there's a sore on the foot. That's going to tell me a lot about the health of the bird, and maybe I need to change something up in the enclosure. So all of those things we look at to help us give a bigger overall picture of what's going on with the bird as a whole.
So even though having this kestrel, you might not be able to answer all of the questions, you can definitely learn so much more being in such a close proximity to the bird and having such regular interaction as compared to a wild American kestrel.
Yes, exactly. And that's kind of the fun of it. Getting a chance to see the birds in the wild. And then I think the fascination of working with them in captivity. Because you see, again, some of the natural behaviors and then some behaviors I'm like, okay, I think that's your imprinting.
Yes.
But just seeing that kind of all come together.
Yeah. Before we began recording, we talked a little bit about your passion for breaking down barriers between people and nature. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
One of the things that I think is so important is encouraging people to kind of realize that they don't necessarily have to go somewhere to find nature. And not that I'm telling people not to come to Dogwood, because I think you should. It's an amazing place. But also understanding that nature is kind of wherever you are. You step outside, there's nature. You can find nature in an urban area. You can find nature in the DFW Metroplex. People seem to think that there's no nature in a big city. Actually, there's so much out here. So I don't want that to hold people back from thinking that they can't go birding.
Yeah.
That they can't enjoy birds, that they can't conserve what we have here. There's so much here that needs to be protected and conserved, not just for the animals in the wildlife here, but for the people that live here.
Yes.
There's a lot, I think, that goes into it. There's a lot of barriers. People, I think there's a lot of fear. We've had groups out here and sometimes kids, I remember a butterfly landed on him and this kid had a meltdown. And I laughed, but then my heart broke because I'm like, it's a butterfly, like it's not going to hurt you. But he had never had that experience before. And that breaks my heart.
Yeah.
It really does. It makes me so sad that, we have kids that haven't been exposed to this. You have people that can't just walk to a park or a nature center. You have people that can't afford the binoculars or the gear or the state park pass to get that.
Yes.
So the question as an educator for me is like, how do I encourage that? How do I break those down when you're struggling with like, I'm too afraid to go out my back door because of so many other things. And so I think it's just trying to tell people like, nature is just where you're at. This is why I love birds so much, because birds don't have barriers. They have wings. They're international. They're going to fly. And this is where, again, that curiosity as a kid comes in. It just kicks in. I can go to, and my friends make fun of me for this all the time, because I'll go to the store and I'll be like, oh my gosh, look, there's a bird. And they're like, there's birds everywhere. I know, but it's a bird. Or we'll be traveling somewhere and I have to stop, or I'll be birding in the car. And I think that's just trying to get people to connect more with what they're seeing.
Yes.
And to just realize like they don't need to spend a lot of money. They don't need to have all those fancy things because nature's right there. So how do we break that barrier? That's kind of just where I come from as an educator. Yeah.
So it's almost just a matter of kind of developing an awareness because it's all there, just being aware of it.
Yeah. And the one thing, we work really hard on teaching about conservation here with the Audubon centers. My big thing is, though, at the end of the day, I cannot teach someone to take care of the environment if they don't have that connection.
Yeah.
So how can I teach someone, hey, you have to take care of that forest over there? And they're like, I don't even know what a forest is.
Yeah.
Or if I say, hey, we have birds that are challenged by climate change. And they're like, you know what? I don't even know where I'm going to get my next meal.
Yeah.
So I think that's where, and I think this is what we're kind of seeing in the environmental world, and just in nature. And as an environmental educator, when we take care of nature and the issues in nature, we're taking care of people. And that's kind of where I'm seeing some of that shift. Because if people don't have their basic needs met, how are we going to tell them, hey, we have to conserve what's around you?
Sure.
Both go hand in hand.
Yes.
And I think that's just kind of where we're coming from, and just trying to be like, hey, nature is an area. This is my area where I find peace, so how can I make that an area for you that you find peace, or you're feeling connected and everything? It's complex. I don't have all the answers, but I also know, like, if you come here, I want you to have a positive experience. You're going to have a positive experience.
Yeah.
And that's just what I want people to have and enjoy when they get outside.
Thinking of the child who had the butterfly land on them and how they reacted, what else do you do here when you encounter something like that to break down that kind of barrier of fear? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I always have to remember that fear comes from a deeper place. So there's a lot of emotions behind it. People are coming from a place of just not knowing, a lack of knowledge. And so I have to come from a place of, one, empathy first, and understanding that people didn't have the same experience I had growing up. A lot of people, people are afraid of snakes. They're afraid of, other issues that may be occurring right now, political issues. Like, if I step in the woods, like, am I going to come back out alive? Things like that. And so getting over those, I have to think about, how can I reassure people when they're here? So for instance, the snake thing is a big one. I will invite people, hey, like, have you ever seen a snake?
Yes.
Or have you ever touched one? And we have snakes that we use in our educational program. So giving them an opportunity to see one up close.
Yes.
Giving them the opportunity to touch that snake, asking them, hey, like, what do you do if you see one?
Yeah.
Just seeing what their response is, and then just walking them through those steps of, like, here's what we can do. Here's what our response can be. And just teaching people, like, we don't have to like that thing, but we can respect it.
Yeah.
So just trying to get on their level and understand where they're coming from. I think that's where people, if you take the time to do that, that'll help them, one, feel heard, and then help them walk through, like, this is where some of those fears are coming from, which are totally understandable.
Sure.
I mean, I would run around picking up snakes as a child. So it's totally different here. And then just working with people, like, I have a lot of friends, especially women, that want to walk out. They want to go hiking, but they don't feel safe walking out hiking by themselves. Yeah. So they'll ask me often, can I walk with you? Can you go hiking with me? I don't have the skills. I don't know how, like, what happens about this? So just walking along and showing them a few things, like, this is how you get prepared. I think sometimes for most people, it's just a lack of knowledge, not knowing what to do, giving them the confidence in doing that.
So once you get to that point of understanding where you kind of understand where they're coming from, then you are able to give them a few tools to add to their toolkit.
Exactly. And I think it's just, once you start from there, then you empower them to take the steps, to make the choices, to be like, hey. And one of the things, with COVID threw a monkey wrench in everybody's plans this past year. But the silver lining was, I think it helped us discover how we can really, truly shift how we do environmental education. Yes, a lot of it was virtual, but I think it made us also realize, like, we need to go out more to our community. Yeah, we ask our community to come to us, but let's go out to our community more. And that's been one of the joyful things, I think, for me, is getting out and being like, hey, I'm going to go and spend time with this community over here. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to make these connections over here. If you can't come to me, let me come to you.
Yeah.
Let me go into your apartment complex. Let me go to this youth camp over here. There's only one of me. I can't be everywhere at once. Sure. But so let's start doing more of that. And I think as we establish those relationships, that's how we can start to be like, hey, again, nature's everywhere. Yeah. People are seeing more wildlife. They're having more of these interactions with wildlife and plants, and they want to know stuff, but sometimes they just don't know where to get started. Yeah. And that's how we can start to form those relationships to break down those barriers and those fears.
Find other ways to get this information to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank Katie for joining us today, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode from. While you're there, I would appreciate it if you left a rating or review to help more people discover the podcast. You can visit lookingatbirds.com for a transcript of the episode and pictures of the American Kestrel, along with some of the other birds mentioned in this episode. Until next time, keep looking at birds.